threats that those members would be forced to join all 214 Democrats to force a vote on the floor. And imagine that you would kill a motion to vote on that one day before you plan to send everyone home for the holiday. Well, welcome to Donald Trump's America and the Republican Congress, where the leadership would rather let children, seniors, veterans, and small businesses lose their health care than even take a vote. Well, thankfully, we have filed a discharge petition that will ripen in 7 legislative days, but we know that is not enough.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
So we are calling on the leadership to call a vote
The
now.
gentlewoman's time has expired.
Did you hear what just happened on the House floor? Because this is the precise moment the entire rotten infrastructure of Trumpist governance reveals itself for the moral catastrophe that progressives have been warning about since November 2016. And what you just witnessed in that clip is Representative Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico refusing to let the theater of cruelty pass without comment and recognition, this searing denunciation of a Republican Party so thoroughly captured by the cruelest impulses of late-stage capitalism and authoritarian disdain for human dignity that they will literally block votes on healthcare the day before they plan to send everyone home for the holidays. And let me be absolutely clear about what is happening right now in real time. Because 4 House Republicans just rebelled against Speaker Mike Johnson on Wednesday, joining Democrats to force a vote on extending key Obamacare subsidies that are set to expire at the end of the year, which should tell you everything you need to know about how politically toxic this position has become, even within the GOP's own ranks. We are watching the culmination of a healthcare crisis manufactured entirely by Republican ideological extremism, and what Representative Stansbury captured in that moment of moral clarity was the obscenity of a party so committed to dismantling the social safety net constructed under the Affordable Care Act that they would rather let millions of Americans' personally paid Obamacare premiums skyrocket than allow a simple up or down vote on extending subsidies that have made healthcare accessible to nearly 22 million people. This is Donald Trump's America indeed, and the fact that phrase resonates with such devastating accuracy should alarm every single person who understands that when we talk about Trump, we are not merely discussing one malignant narcissist, but rather an entire ecosystem of Republican governance that has abandoned even the pretense of caring about ordinary Americans in favor of serving the twin gods of tax cuts for the wealthy and ideological purity tests that sacrifice human lives on the altar of market fundamentalism, because what is happening right here is not simply procedural obstruction, but rather a calculated act of violence against the most vulnerable populations in this country. If the enhanced premium tax credits expire as is expected, insurance costs are projected to double, on average for about 22 million people who get their coverage through Obamacare, which means we are talking about children losing access to preventative care, seniors unable to afford medications that keep them alive, veterans who served this country being told their health care is not worth a simple vote, small business owners who finally got coverage through the exchanges watching their premiums explode into unaffordability. The cruelty is not incidental here. The cruelty is the entire point. Because what the Republican Party has learned in the Trump era is that their base rewards them not for governance, but for the performance of grievance and the systematic dismantling of anything that smells like collective responsibility or social solidarity. And this is where we must understand that healthcare is not simply a policy question, but fundamentally a moral question about what kind of society we choose to construct and who we decide deserves the basic dignity of medical care without bankruptcy. Now, I want you to understand the sheer magnitude of cynicism at work in this moment, because Republicans on the House Rules Committee declined to allow Fitzpatrick and other moderates an amendment vote on extending the credits as part of a separate GOP healthcare bill set to be voted on Wednesday, which means Republican leadership understood that if this came to an actual vote, it would pass because even members of their own caucus recognized the political suicide of letting these subsidies expire. So instead, they deployed every procedural trick in the authoritarian playbook to prevent democracy from functioning, to prevent representatives from representing, to prevent the most basic mechanism of governance, which is allowing elected officials to vote on matters of life and death importance to their constituents. And then the House on Wednesday cleared a Republican healthcare package, 2116-211, that does not extend the expiring Affordable Care Act subsidies, passing instead a hollow shell of supposed healthcare reform that does absolutely nothing to address the impending crisis, while allowing Republicans to claim they voted on healthcare. This is the same playbook they have been running for 15 years, where they promise to repeal and replace Obamacare with something better, and yet somehow that something better never materializes, because their actual healthcare plan is to let market forces sort out who deserves to live and who deserves to die, based on their ability to pay. The historical echoes here should make your blood run cold, because what we are witnessing is the continuation of a project that stretches back through 40 years of neoliberal governance, this relentless assault on the New Deal consensus that healthcare and housing and education should be considered public goods rather than profit centers. And when Ronald Reagan declared that government is the problem, not the solution, he was articulating an ideological framework that has led us directly to this moment, where Republican leadership would rather let millions suffer than admit that collective action through government programs might actually improve human welfare. This is the same Republican Party that fought Social Security, that fought Medicare, that fought Medicaid, that fought the Civil Rights Act, that fought every single expansion of human dignity and material security that progressives have achieved through decades of organizing and coalition building, and their opposition is never actually about fiscal responsibility or limited government, but rather about maintaining hierarchies of power and ensuring that the wealthy face no obligation to contribute to the collective well-being of the society that made their wealth possible in the first place. And the discharge petition that Representative Stansbury mentions is itself a devastating indictment of Republican governance, because 4 Republicans joined 214 Democrats in signing a discharge petition to force a vote on extending expiring subsidies offered under the Affordable Care Act. And understand what this procedural mechanism represents in the context of our current political crisis. It represents the absolute breakdown of normal legislative function. It represents the fact that Republican leadership has become so captured by extremist ideology that even moderates within their own party have to resort to extraordinary measures just to get a vote on legislation that would prevent mass suffering. Under House rules, 7 legislative days need to lapse before a bill discharged by such a petition comes to the floor, and the House is only scheduled to be in session until Thursday afternoon before lawmakers head home for a 2-week holiday recess, which means even this extraordinary intervention will come too late to prevent the subsidies from expiring. Even this act of rebellion from within Republican ranks cannot overcome the sheer bloody-mindedness of a party committed to inflicting maximum damage on the social safety net before anyone can stop them. The Trump connection here is not superficial or merely rhetorical, but deeply structural, because what Trump represented and continues to represent is the Republican Party finally saying the quiet part loud, finally dropping the pretense of compassionate conservatism or any of the other euphemistic frameworks they deployed to disguise their fundamental hostility to the very concept of collective responsibility, and most Republican lawmakers are staunchly opposed to a simple extension, with GOP Rep. Keith Self of Texas saying, "The bottom line is, let them expire." When asked about the subsidies, which is the kind of sociopathic indifference to mass suffering that Trump normalized throughout his presidency, and that has now become the baseline position of the entire Republican caucus. Trump did not create this cruelty, but he made it permissible. He made it electorally viable. He demonstrated that you could campaign on taking health care away from millions of people and still win elections if you wrapped that cruelty in nationalist rhetoric and racial resentment and promised to hurt the right people, and the Republican Party looked at that formula and said, yes, this is who we want to be. This is the political identity we choose to inhabit. Now let us talk about what this means for the material conditions of actual human beings, because this is not abstract policy discussion, but rather a question of whether families can afford insulin or cancer treatment or prenatal care, and the Congressional Budget Office estimates that, if the subsidies expire, the premiums people pay are expected to more than double next year, and an estimated 2 million more people will be uninsured, which represents a public health catastrophe of staggering proportions that Republicans are willing to engineer purely to satisfy their ideological opposition to government programs that work. Think about what it means for a parent to receive notification that their child's health insurance premium is doubling in January. Think about the impossible calculations that families will be forced to make between health care and rent, between medications and groceries, between doctor visits and utility bills. This is the face of Republican governance in Trump's America, where human suffering is understood not as a problem to be solved, but as an acceptable externality in the pursuit of tax cuts and deregulation, and the systematic transfer of wealth upward to the already wealthy. The discourse around fiscal responsibility here is particularly galling, because extending the enhanced subsidies would cost around $35 billion per year, or $350 billion over the next decade according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is exactly the amount Republicans just gave away to the wealthy in their previous tax bill, exactly the amount they spend without question on military contractors and fossil fuel subsidies and corporate bailouts, But somehow when it comes to healthcare for ordinary Americans, we suddenly need to worry about the deficit and fiscal discipline. This is the great con of conservative economic policy laid bare, the insistence that we cannot afford to help people while simultaneously funneling trillions to those who need it least. And the American people are beginning to understand that fiscal conservatism was never actually about responsible budgeting, but rather about constructing an ideological justification for letting poor people die while rich people accumulate ever greater wealth. And we must understand this in the broader context of the Trump administration's systematic assault on healthcare, because while Republicans failed to achieve their explicit goal of repealing Obamacare outright, they have pursued death by 1,000 cuts, undermining the exchanges through regulatory sabotage, cutting funding for outreach and enrollment, imposing work requirements on Medicaid recipients, and now allowing these enhanced subsidies to expire, undermine individual action designed to make the Affordable Care Act fail, so they can then point to that failure as evidence that government programs do not work. This is the standard neoliberal playbook where you defund and sabotage public services, and then privatize them when the inevitable problems emerge. Except in this case, the thing being privatized is healthcare, and the inevitable consequence is that poor people cannot access medical care and die preventable deaths. Democrats are already planning to use that predicted fallout against the GOP in next year's midterm elections, hoping it will prove as effective as it did in the 2018 midterms, when Republicans lost control of the House in part because of their efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act the year before, which should tell you something about the political calculation Republicans are making here. They understand this is unpopular, and yet they are doing it anyway, because their commitment to ideological purity and their subservience to wealthy donors who want to dismantle social programs outweighs any concern for either human suffering or electoral consequences. The specific populations being harmed here tell you everything about Republican priorities, because these subsidies disproportionately benefit working-class families, rural Americans in red states who finally gained access to affordable coverage, small business owners and self-employed people who do not receive employer-sponsored insurance, precisely the constituencies that Republicans claim to represent, and yet consistently betray in favor of corporate interests. Many Affordable Care Act enrollees are Republican, with the enhanced subsidies helping spur a record 24 million people to sign up for 2025 coverage, many of them from red states, and more than half of Obamacare enrollees live in districts represented by a Republican, which exposes the grotesque irony that Republicans are engineering a healthcare crisis that will devastate their own constituents, but they are so captured by anti-government ideology and so committed to opposing anything associated with Obama or Democrats that they would rather hurt their own voters than admit that the Affordable Care Act has been successful at expanding coverage and saving lives. The procedural violence of blocking this vote before the holiday recess is particularly revealing because it demonstrates the contempt that Republican leadership holds for the basic functioning of democratic governance. Rep. Mike Lawler said that not holding a vote on the subsidies would be political malpractice, and that when leadership blocks action entirely, Congress has a responsibility to act. And yet Speaker Johnson refused to allow even an amendment vote, refused to let representatives go on record, refused to permit the most basic mechanism of accountability, because he knew that if the vote happened, the subsidies would be extended, and Republicans would be forced to admit that Obamacare is popular and necessary and worth preserving. This is authoritarian governance dressed up in parliamentary procedure, the use of technical rules to prevent democracy from functioning, to prevent representatives from representing, to prevent the will of the people from being expressed even when that will is supported by members of both parties. Now I want to connect this to the broader project of understanding Trump-era politics as fundamentally about the restoration of hierarchy and the punishment of those who threaten traditional power structures, because healthcare is perhaps the most vivid example of this dynamic where the expansion of access represents a leveling force that gives working-class people and poor people and marginalized communities the same basic security that wealthy people take for granted. And for conservatives, this is intolerable, not because of any reasoned policy objection, but because it undermines the natural order of things where your access to medical care should depend on your economic productivity and your place in the social hierarchy. This is why they talk about people not deserving health care, or not earning health care, or being dependent on government handouts. The language reveals a moral framework that understands suffering as a just punishment for insufficient market participation, rather than as a policy failure that could be addressed through collective action. The fact that Republicans operate with a razor-thin 222-13 majority, with Speaker Johnson presiding over the smallest majority in U.S. history, according to the Speaker himself, means that even a handful of defections can force votes that leadership wants to avoid. and this should give progressives hope, because it demonstrates that organized pressure and strategic action can overcome even the most obstinate leadership. It shows that when constituents demand accountability, and when members face electoral consequences for cruelty, change becomes possible even within a party, as ideologically captured as the current Republican caucus. This is why movements matter, why organizing matters, why putting pressure on vulnerable members matters, because democracy is not just about elections, but about the constant application of power from below, to force those in office to respond to popular demands rather than donor preferences. And we should understand Representative Stansbury's intervention here as part of a long tradition of progressive politicians refusing to let injustice pass unremarked, refusing to permit the normalization of cruelty, insisting that we name what is happening and call it what it is, rather than hiding behind euphemism and procedural language that obscures the human stakes. When she says welcome to Donald Trump's America and the Republican Congress, where the leadership would rather let children, seniors, veterans, and small businesses lose their health care than even take a vote, she is performing the essential work of making visible what power wants to keep hidden, of forcing the comfortable to confront the consequences of their political choices, of creating a record that historians will look back on and understand who stood for human dignity and who stood for the systematic infliction of suffering in service of ideology and wealth accumulation. The connection to veterans specifically is particularly grotesque because Republicans wrap themselves in the flag and perform patriotism at every opportunity while simultaneously denying health care to people who served in the military, and this hypocrisy extends across their entire policy agenda, where they claim to support families while cutting child care funding, claim to support small business while favoring corporate monopolies, claim to support workers while undermining unions and opposing minimum wage increases. The disconnect between rhetoric and policy is so vast that it can only be understood as deliberate deception, as a strategy of misdirection where cultural grievance and identity politics distract from material harm. Sen. Josh Hawley, one of only a handful of GOP senators who joined Democrats in voting to preserve the credits, warned that Congress needs to act on the subsidies, saying, "I know so many parents in Missouri who are scared to death they're not going to be able to take their kids to the doctor." That's a very valid concern, which shows that even some Republicans understand the catastrophic nature of what their party is engineering, and yet the machinery of obstruction grinds forward because ideology trumps humanity, because serving donors trumps serving constituents, because maintaining party discipline trumps preventing mass suffering. The Senate dynamics here are equally revealing because Republicans in the Senate rejected the 3-year funding extension just last week, with Majority Leader John Thune slamming the COVID-era ACA subsidies and saying he favors a broader overhaul, not just an extension of those funds, which is the classic Republican move of making the perfect the enemy of the good, of insisting that we cannot extend subsidies without comprehensive reform, while simultaneously refusing to engage in good faith negotiations on what that reform might look like. This is how you manufacture crisis, and then blame the other side for the crisis you manufactured. This is how you create the conditions for suffering while maintaining plausible deniability about your role in creating those conditions. And the American people are increasingly seeing through this performance and understanding that Republican healthcare policy begins and ends with protecting the profits of insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations, while leaving ordinary people to navigate an inhumane and predatory system alone. And we must connect this to the broader assault on the social safety net, because healthcare is just one front in a comprehensive campaign to dismantle every form of collective security that New Deal and Great Society liberals constructed over the course of the 20th century. Republicans are coming for Social Security and Medicare, and Medicaid and food assistance and housing support, and every other program that recognizes a collective obligation to ensure baseline human dignity, and they are doing this not because these programs are failing or unaffordable, but because the very existence of robust public programs contradicts their ideological commitment to market fundamentalism and their political commitment to serving wealthy donors who resent paying taxes that support people they consider undeserving. The Trump era made this agenda explicit, where previous generations of Republicans tried to hide it behind compassionate rhetoric, and that explicitness is both terrifying in its implications and clarifying in its honesty, because at least now we know exactly what we are fighting against. The failure of Trump's alternative healthcare plan is particularly instructive here, because President Trump's push for a new healthcare plan has stalled, amid disagreements within the GOP over the extension of key Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies, and the White House initially expected to roll out a plan last week that paired an extension of the subsidies with a range of conservative reforms, but that was scrapped following sharp backlash from Republican lawmakers, who were blindsided by the framework and deeply opposed to its core elements, which demonstrates that Republicans cannot even agree among themselves on healthcare because their only unifying principle is opposition to government programs. They have no affirmative vision for how healthcare should work, no actual plan for covering people or controlling costs, just an inchoate rage against Obamacare and a desperate desire to serve insurance industry donors. This intellectual bankruptcy is the direct result of decades of conservative movement building that prioritized ideological purity over practical governance, that rewarded politicians for their ability to obstruct rather than construct, that created an entire ecosystem where conservative credibility depends on your opposition to government rather than your ability to make government work for ordinary people. The discharge petition that will likely come to a vote in January when Congress returns reveals both the possibility and the limits of procedural resistance, because the House is set to return to Washington on January 6, meaning the vote on the 3-year extension will likely be held in the second week of that month, unless Johnson attempts to expedite it to the floor. And by that time the subsidies will have already expired, and millions will have received notices of doubled premiums, and some will have already dropped coverage because they cannot afford it. So even this intervention, which represents an extraordinary act of defiance from within Republican ranks, comes too late to prevent immediate harm. And this is the tragedy of fighting defensive battles against an opposition committed to inflicting maximum damage. You can slow them down and occasionally stop them, but the human cost accumulates while you fight. This is why progressives must move beyond simply defending the Affordable Care Act and start advocating for Medicare for all, for a system where healthcare is understood as a human right, rather than a commodity to be purchased, where access depends on need rather than ability to pay, where profit is removed from the equation entirely, so that medical decisions are made based on health outcomes rather than shareholder returns. The fact that Republican members who signed the discharge petition recognize the problem in front of them, which is these hugely escalatory spikes in premiums that their constituents are facing, and they're feeling the heat from constituents back home, according to Senator Murkowski, who noted that at some point in time, you just can't sit there and listen to your leadership say, "We're not going to do anything," tells you that constituent pressure matters, that organizing matters, that making your representatives afraid of electoral consequences matters, and this should be the lesson that progressives take from this moment, not despair about Republican cruelty, which we already knew about, but rather hope about the possibility of fracturing Republican unity through strategic pressure on vulnerable members. Every phone call matters, every town hall matters, every protest matters, every act of making visible the human cost of these policy choices matters, because politicians respond to power, and the threat of losing elections represents a form of power that can overcome even the most well-funded lobbying campaign or the most ideologically committed leadership, and we should recognize that the 4 Republicans who signed the discharge petition, Reps. Brian Fitzpatrick, Mike Lawler, Rob Bresnahan, and Ryan McKenzie, all from Pennsylvania and New York, represent competitive districts where the political consequences of letting subsidies expire are simply too dangerous to ignore, which tells you that even in the most gerrymandered and polarized political environment, electoral considerations can still produce moments of accountability, and our task as progressives is to create more of those moments by making the political cost of cruelty higher than the political cost of compassion, by organizing effectively enough that Republicans in swing districts understand that serving their donors at the expense of their constituents will end their careers. This is long-term movement-building work that requires patience and persistence and strategic thinking about where pressure can be most effective, but it is precisely this work that produced the moment we just witnessed, where Republican members felt compelled to break with leadership despite the enormous pressure to maintain party unity. Representative Stansbury's framing of this as Trump's America is devastatingly accurate, because what we are witnessing is not merely bad policy, but the manifestation of a worldview that understands politics as a zero-sum competition, where helping some people necessarily requires hurting others, where compassion is weakness and cruelty is strength, where the measure of governance is not human flourishing, but rather the maintenance of hierarchy and the punishment of those who threaten it. This is authoritarian politics dressed up in democratic procedure. This is fascism with a parliamentary face, and the fact that it is happening through committee votes and discharge petitions rather than through violence in the streets does not make it any less dangerous or any less urgent to resist. The stakes here are not simply whether 22 million people retain access to affordable health care, though that alone would justify every ounce of resistance we can muster, but rather whether we inhabit a society that recognizes any collective obligation to care for one another, or whether we descend fully into a Hobbesian nightmare where atomized individuals compete for resources and the losers simply die. This is the fight of our generation. This is the essential question of 21st century politics. And what you just witnessed in that clip was a progressive champion refusing to let that fight pass unremarked, refusing to permit the normalization of cruelty, insisting that we see clearly what is being done, and who is doing it, and what the human cost will be. Representative Stansbury stood on that floor and named the crime as it was being committed, created a record for history, gave voice to the millions who will suffer because of Republican obstruction, and in doing so performed the essential work of democratic resistance, the work of making power visible and holding it accountable, and refusing to let injustice become just another day's business in the House of Representatives. And when the subsidies expire and premiums double, and families lose coverage and preventable suffering multiplies across this country, remember this moment, remember who fought to prevent it and who engineered it. Remember that cruelty was a choice made by people with names and faces and voting records, and commit yourself to the long struggle of building a movement powerful enough to ensure that never again will healthcare be held hostage to ideology, and that never again will human dignity be sacrificed on the altar of tax cuts for the wealthy and service to corporate donors, because the alternative is unthinkable, and the time for action is right now before us, this very second, in every community and every organizing space and every moment we choose resistance over resignation.